I have a woefully undersubscribed subreddit, so please do me a favour. If you're a Redditor, head on over to r/Postmortem Studios and talk about anything related to any of my shenanigans. Peace. Hey, so I wanted to talk about the various books that Miguel Ribeiro has done for me. He's a Portuguese writer who is obsessed and interested in pulp culture, like Italian knockoff horror films or the Giallo pulps. You're probably more familiar with Giallo as a cinematic style, Dario Argento, all of that sort of thing, but originally it started in yellow cover, hence Giallo, which means yellow, pulp novels, with a much more free and open and libertine attitude to a lot of content, even than Western pulp magazines and so on. His latest for me is Welcome to Sincloud, which is more of a David Lynch pastiche, but it's still in the spirit of Giallo and pulps. The Giallo pulps were pretty shameless in what they ripped off. They were a more sort of high quality, innovative and interesting version of the mockbuster that we see in Sci-Fi Channel movies and so on, trying to pass themselves off as being the same thing as bigger budget films. Like instead of Pacific Rim, you might get Atlantic Rim or something like that. Seemingly their entire business model is reliant on grandparents not understanding what their kids want and getting confused and buying them the wrong thing, but whatever, it seems to work for them. But this phenomenon is something that we see in spaghetti westerns or various of the dead films trying to cash in on Romero's success. So it's a style, it's a thing, it's a historical thing, and it plays into a lot of things about role-playing games which are often rather derivative or inspired by what we see in films and other popular media, trying to recreate it in a way that is accessible and that doesn't infringe copyright. So far, Miguel has made for me Welcome to Sincloud, Sisters of the Seven Sins, which is one of the Giallo ones, The Memorial, another Giallo one, and Orpheum Lofts, which is the first one he published with me. I've done the layout, he's done the writing, I've done the editing, and a few other people have been consulted here and there, but I wanted to tackle them as a block because of their similarity in that they play into that Giallo tradition of and Italian horror tradition of ripping off things that exist and reframing them or doing their own thing off the back of the same idea, and because Miguel's approach to game supplement writing, adventure writing, is different enough that it requires some attention, I think. I'm not a huge fan of publishing adventures. They don't sell particularly well, which is a problem that most RPG designers will admit to you, because they have such limited use, typically. Technically, these are all adventures, but I was more happy to publish them because there is replay value. There is content in these books sufficient to run several mini campaigns or one long campaign, and not everything is spelled out exactly. It's not quite right to call these adventure books, and it's not quite right to call them setting books. They're somewhere in between. What I'm toying with calling them is something like adventure contexts, These can be used in a systemless fashion, so you could use any kind of game system that you wanted with them. But they do have statistics for actual fucking monsters, which, as it turns out, is actually a pretty good system for this kind of relatively low-key, borderline supernatural sort of setting. So the Orpheum Lofts is... it's a setting, it's an adventure, but it's not a complete setting, and it's not a complete adventure. It doesn't lead you by the hand, it presents you with all the bits and pieces that you might need, but then lets you do your own thing within that setting. So I would say they're intermediate to advanced adventures, if you want to take them as adventures, but they're also setting books in a lot of ways, but not complete. And they don't really need a system, but we have a system in here for you. So the Orpheum Lofts is a set of buildings in New York, sort of nebulously in the 70s or 80s, perhaps, with a lot of characters, many of which are playable, all of which have secrets. And then there are things going on and related to the location that you may or may not stumble upon, that you may or may not want to focus on for an adventure. It's a hard thing to describe, really, but think of it as a very tightly focused location description with a lot of character descriptions, a lot of character secrets, a very roleplay heavy oriented thing, with almost a sort of soap opera element to it, and horror, and in this case ghosts and supernatural architecture and things just sort of hanging around in the background. So it's a very roleplay heavy, drama heavy, very focused, very fixated sort of setting, but one in which, despite the relative slenderness of the volume, you can make a whole campaign out of, mini campaign perhaps, out of. And if you're starved for supplementary material for actual fucking monsters, even though this isn't really a monster scenario, at best it's a hunter scenario, there might be something there for you. I'm particularly happy with the graphic design that I've accomplished on these books. Being freed from writing and editing leaves more energy and time for doing that sort of thing. The Memorial is a similar sort of thing. It's set within the confines of a hospital. The Memorial, again, there's a lot of drama and secrets and personal interactions between the characters and the non-player characters. So it's more suited to gamers who are very roleplay heavy, that like to get into their characters, that like to inhabit their characters. And again, it's a kind of hyper-real setting where everything is slightly overblown, where there is an emphasis on drama, secrets, interpersonal strife, so intra-party strife perhaps. And again, the supernatural elements are there if you want them, in that there may be a haunting or victims of medical experiments and that sort of thing living within the hospital. But again, it's a context. You're not kind of led through the nose. There's no particularly specific adventure. There are plot hooks, there are story ideas, and so on. And again, there are statistics for actual fucking monsters. So you can either use that system, which does work pretty well for this sort of thing, surprisingly, or you can just use that as a sort of guideline for your own system. In AFM, statistics typically run in terms of dice, d4, d6, d8, d10, d12. So you've got a scale of 5 that you can interpret into various other games. But again, it's hard to describe, but it's an adventure context. Like, you might get a setting book and you will get all kinds of details about various locations within the setting and perhaps some story hooks. This is kind of like that, but very focused on a particular location, in this case a hospital. And lastly, in our exploitation series, we have Sisters of the Seven Sins. which is set in and around a nunnery, with some rather dark and seedy goings on there. Nunsploitation would be the genre, I suppose. Again, we have the statistics for actual fucking monsters, but any sort of modern or investigative oriented game would probably work. Trailer Cthulhu, Call of Cthulhu would be good choices for this one, perhaps. And again, there's sort of sex and drugs and vice and so on going on, all connected to this nunnery, and the sisters within it. But then there's also the supernatural elements alongside, which again are kind of pastiches and rip-offs, but in the tradition of the Giallo, of the pulps, in taking something that exists and making something independent or more out of it. And frankly, there's no real problem with that when it comes to role-playing games. They've always been that way. Derivative works, if you will, trying to recreate the sense of a particular form of other media, as well as creating their own independent kinds of media as well. But it doesn't suffer for it. There's no reason why you shouldn't take inspiration from these sources. So if you want something kind of Catholic nun fetishy, this is probably the most horror adjacent of the books, then that's the one to get. Then we have Welcome to Sincloud, which is the sort of David Lynch Twin Peaks pastiche. And I took a very different approach on the design of this one, almost making it like a brochure or a tourist leaflet, really sort of playing up the desolation of it, and almost having no illustrations of people within the book, trying to make it seem almost cozy, to be honest. This is a much more expansive location, but again, it follows the same model. There are lots of people, many of which you could play as characters, and their secrets and the interactions between their secrets, and some oddness and weirdness, which is much more to the fore here. So if you like a kind of Lynchian surreality to your games, then this one would be your best choice. And again, there are supernaturalistic and horror elements that you can either play up or play down as you use the book, as you use the resource here. There's an evil lurking in the woods and having a horrendous influence upon the people within. There's a whole gang of inbreds living in the hills and the forests and in a smaller setting. And again, you can use any system. It comes with stats for AFM, but you could use Trailer Cthulhu, Call of Cthulhu, Chill, perhaps. Any of those sorts of things. Even Palladium's horror settings. So there's plenty of material here, but again, it's not explicitly an adventure. And if you view it as a setting book, then it can seem a bit thin and a bit hyper-focused, but it's a position for adventures that works for me, that makes sense for me, where you get lots of stuff that you can use over and again, the setting, the place, the people, and not just a one and done, one pump chump sort of adventure in a more typical vein. Coming up next, we have Postcards from a Valadad, which is a sort of Barrosian homage to Interzone and Naked Lunch, but with a kind of cyberpunky vibe and bent to it, almost. So that should be interesting. I've got the text for that edited. I need to carve out some time to do the layout and finish that up. But hopefully I can do something innovative and weird with the layout, as I have done with these books, due to having the more time to spend on it. But for me, this is an interesting solution to the problem of adventures. The problem of adventures being, again, that they are just kind of one and done, you can't really do that much with them once you've played through them. But with this, there's enough material to do whole mini campaigns, but it's not set in stone, so you don't get bogged down or stuck railroading people in the way that you otherwise might with regular adventure books. And so it's an interesting and effective approach to the adventure problem that I think Miguel has stumbled upon here. And in my not so humble opinion, and obviously because I sell the books, I think they're worth picking up to consider as being an approach to adventures in the future, away from the more traditional model that we have, and just to celebrate what a lot of us do anyway, which is filing the serial numbers off something, mixing it with something else, and then putting it out as an original creation. Zang.
Zang Station is an addition to Machinations of the Space Princess. It's a whole sleazy space station, full of locations, services, adventures and inspiration for your old school space opera games. Over 100 locations, a bevy of non-player characters, and more plot hooks than you can shake an Arcturan mega stick at. Buy it at post-mort.com, drive-thru RPG, and hard copy at lulu.com.
Well, I look at it myself as the beginning, really, of an exploration. That's the reason we're exploring. You don't know what you'll run into on an exploration. What the sky looks like, what the stars look like. Do they still twinkle, or are they a steady light when you get outside the atmosphere?